We started last week with the Great Commission and just this idea that, well, if we are talking about the church, we got to start with, well, where did the church start? It started, we had this Great Commission, it started with Christ, and then it kind of keeps going forward. And so now we get to kind of see what that process looks like as we get to keep going forward. So exactly, awesome stuff. So hopefully, even if you weren't able to be with us last week, hopefully now you kind of have an understanding of where we started, and then we get to jump into where we are today. So we're on the second page in your guys' workbooks, and it's the one with the arrows on it. And so we'll start by reading through. So we're going to start with reading Acts 15, which should be inside your guys' books, and I'll read that now. So, certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. The church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, they told how the Gentiles were converted. The news made all the believers very glad. And when they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. So we get to see this cool piece where, well, Paul and Barnabas are coming into this sharp dispute with these people. There's debate about, well, how are we supposed to live? Are we supposed to follow the custom taught by Moses? Are we supposed to be circumcised? Is that the news we want to spread to the Gentiles? Or is that not something we need to do anymore? And there's some people saying you do, and Paul and Barnabas saying you don't. And you come to this point where it's like, well, if I'm saying this, and you're saying that, and we've done all these, you need an authority. You get to this point where it's like, well, the debate's going to go on forever and ever and ever until we have an authority to kind of like step in and answer the question and answer the questions that the young church has. And so this is where we get to step into, well, this is the blessing of having these apostles, these young leaders that learned and grew with Christ and that were commissioned to go out, is now we have this authority to kind of like answer these questions and make sure, what do we know is true? What is Jesus taught? And what are the things that are going to continue to be taught as we get to start out? Because they want to make sure they get it right now, because if they don't get it correct, then it's going to persist and it's going to be, wrong forever and ever. And so that's the blessing of having these apostles that Paul and Barnabas were able to go to and talk with, the apostles and then the elders. And so they get to report this good report. So we move into these arrows here. So if you're following along, you get to kind of write these things in. But we get to start off with this question of, what is the relationship between the Old Testament law and Christianity? So does anybody want to talk about that? What is the relationship? Because that relates to the passage you're doing before, because they had the Old Testament law of Moses and circumcision and the practices. And how does that relate to Christianity, this new movement that Jesus has, or that's starting now?
That's a huge question.
Yeah. Yeah. And are they related at all? Is it something where the Old Testament law and Christianity are totally separate, and now that we have Christianity, we don't need the law? There's a little bit of a spoiler on the right there, but do you got something, David? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Does anyone else want to say anything else on this piece? But I think, that's an excellent starting point with what Jesus is saying. Well, if you have anything else to say, I'd love to hear it. But yeah, it's this piece that we've got here, in that the relationship between the Old Testament law and Christianity is that it's not, Jesus didn't come to get rid of it. He's not here to abolish the law and remove it, but he's bringing it to ultimate fulfillment. Because and maybe this is an easier way if we break the question down into pieces. What was the point of the Old Testament law? What purpose did it serve for the Israelites? Yeah, they had this sin, and God can't tolerate sin, and so it's a way to come back into relationship and from the sin that separates them. We got anything else? Anything else that the Old Testament law did for the people? Gave them a guideline, exactly. It's hard to follow God and do what he's commanded if you don't know what he's commanded. We got anything else that sticks out about what the Old Testament law did for the people of the Old Testament? It helped them to see their sin, yeah. To know that there is something they're doing wrong that needs to change. Do you have something back there, Oliver? Yeah. It was a way for God to care for and guide his people, both spiritually and physically, separating them from the sin and the corruption and the sickness of the world. And so I think that what that piece is, and I think the something that the people in the Old Testament often failed to understand is the Old Testament law was a way for them to go from being in this sinful state where God couldn't tolerate them to being back into a relationship with him. It was a way to get connected again with God. And so it was never about like, well, what's the quality of the sacrifice and what sheep did I use and those parts and pieces were a part of it, but it wasn't about the things they were doing. It was about being back into relationship with God, and they were doing these physical acts and spiritual acts of like sacrifice to come back into relationship with God. And so that's why it isn't changed, because while the acts we do may change, we're not sacrificing anything. I don't know about you guys. Before I come into church today, I didn't take a goat and like put my sins on it and send it out into Grand Rapids or something. You know, I didn't have to do that anymore. But I am, through the ultimate sacrifice in Jesus Christ, through him dying on the cross, through that perfect sacrifice, I am coming back into relationship with God. So I am able to do those things. So while the point of being in a relationship with God hasn't changed, the way we do it has. And so that's why it's not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So it's changing it to the point where now instead of trying to use these limited, sinful, animals to try to do this, we have the perfect sacrifice in Christ. And so that's how we've reached this fulfillment through Christ. So basically, that's what's happening here. Is like we've come to this point where it's like this is what we realize. We realize that we're coming back in a relationship with God. We're not abolishing the law, but we're doing it through fulfillment. And so what we see here is this new, Jewish sect called the Way, following the teaching of Christ and identifying him as Messiah has begun. And so this is what is happening. We've got this Great Commission. We've got people sending out. They're called the Way. Eventually they will be called Christians. I think it's at Antioch, but I don't remember exactly. But anyways, they begin to be called Ephesus. Yes, Ephesus. Yeah. So at Ephesus, they begin to be called Christians, but it's this new way following Jesus Christ as the Messiah. And the early leaders of that are these apostles that we're learning about today. So we've learned kind of what's the thing they're following, what's the truth from Christ that the apostles are bringing. So now let's learn about, so we've got these apostles, but how do we know they truly believed? It could be very easy to assume that this was a rapidly spreading movement. It could be seen as a way to get power or money. This could be something that could be totally used to their advantage. How do we know that they really believed in God? How do we know that what they were proclaiming, this law, this fulfillment, this relationship with God was actually something that was happening in their lives? Well, we get to read here in John chapter 20, verse 19 through 23, that on the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked, for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands at his side, and the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven, and if you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." So we see two really important pieces here. What are the things that are kind of sticking out to you that we're kind of seeing here in terms of like why did the apostles, how do we know they truly believed? Has anyone seen anything that for why the apostles know they truly believed? Yosef. Yeah, Jesus gave them authority. And that's really good, Yosef, because that's the part that why the apostles have authority. That's the part we were talking about before, right here. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you don't, then they won't. This is where they're given the authority. So this is why the apostles matter. This is why it's important to see them as the authority figures in the young church. So exactly right. But we also see something. What do we see in the first part as to why we may know that like they're getting this awesome authority? This is great. Is it all great? Is it all just good stuff happening in this passage, or are we seeing anything else maybe sticking out? That's okay if you don't. Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they are. Jesus is showing his power. He's showing his authority, and that's exactly right. They're afraid of the Jewish leaders. They know that this is not a popular thing they're spreading. They know that the message that Jesus has, this fulfillment of the law, is not something that people like. People in the Old Testament, they wanted this law, they wanted this authority because a lot of these Jewish leaders saw it as a way to have power. They saw it as a way to have authority in their earthly human means, and it was a way for them to have this position. So they didn't like that these guys were coming in. They didn't like that these guys were given authority. They didn't like that they were trying to do their own thing and pull people to Christ. And so, yeah, they've got it out for them. And so there is fear associated with this. And I think it's cool that we get to see that even in the time when these apostles are afraid, even when the time when these apostles are worried for their safety, Jesus comes in and says, I'm giving you authority to speak truth, to forgive sins, to be these people. And so we get to see right at the beginning here, they truly believe because even in the fear, Jesus is giving them this authority. And so another,
Why are the apostles afraid? Like, what are they afraid of? Why? What did the Jewish leaders do to Jesus? Yes, they killed him. What would they do to his followers? The same thing.
Yeah,
They believe in Jesus so much, though, that they're willing to do that. And I think that's a big point here as well that I want to just make sure we hit on before the next slide, because it's a good transition point.
yes, exactly.
But that they're afraid because they believe in Jesus so much that they're like, oh, we might die too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a legitimate fear. Yeah.
I was just going to say, like, apostles and disciples are really two different sets of people, right? They're not the same people.
Yeah, not all disciples are apostles. Yeah, not all disciples are apostles,
Yeah, so apostles
but the apostles were
were taught
disciples.
directly by Jesus, and disciples were taught by them.
Yeah, but Jesus had disciples. So it's kind of that square rectangle thing. But exactly right. Yeah, not all apostles were disciples. Or I mean, not all disciples are apostles, but but the apostles were disciples. That's confusing. But you're right. This is a lot of people getting authority in the same way that we're not apostles, even though we are disciples. But you're right. So there's a separation there. And I think that's an important thing to stick out. But yeah. Sweet. So we've come to this point where, exactly like David was saying, they're afraid. They're afraid that they could very well face the same fate as Jesus, and they are still, trusting in him. And we get to see here that it's not a fear unplaced. It's not one that doesn't come without basis, because most of the apostles do experience gruesome death because of their belief in Jesus. We can see that. We know that they believed because to the point of dying, to the point of facing not just, a quick death, but terrible deaths, they followed Jesus. We've got all kinds of things here. We've got Peter, who was crucified upside down. We've got Andrew, who was crucified on an X-shaped cross. We've got John, who died naturally, but wasn't really a good end of his life. It was still a tough time. We have James who was crucified. We have Philip who was crucified. We've got Bartholomew who was skinned alive. Thomas was slain by a spear. Matthew was killed by a halberd. James the son of Alphaeus was stoned to death. Thaddeus was killed with arrows. Simon was sawed in half. And Matthias was beheaded. I don't think I would want any of these things to happen, and I imagine that this is not the ways they wanted to go. This isn't the slowly, dying in their sleep in their 88 years of life that they maybe were hoping or expecting when they were just fishermen. But we can see that there is a real change through Christ and through his truth, and they believed in it. Because you can't go through these things for the sake of something you don't believe in. And so I think it's important to not move past that, and that there's real strong belief there. And it's not just these guys. These are the apostles. These are the leaders of the church that died in this way. But it talks about, I believe it's in Hebrews, there's like tons and tons of people, and there's still people today that have died or are tortured or are facing terrible, terrible things for the name of Christ. And you have to, there's just a real strong belief there to go through those things. Because if you don't believe in it, you'll just be like, I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe I wasn't thinking all this stuff through. I'm going to say no, and then I'll want to avoid these things. But we can see that these church leaders gave it all up for Christ. And I think that'll jump into maybe one of my first questions, but I think it does. Yeah. So, that'll be the second question. But we get to see, I guess before we move into the turn and talk, this is like tough stuff that they're going through, but they are doing it because they totally believe in Christ. Is there anything that's that's sticking out to you or that you know about the apostles before we move into the turn and talk piece? Or yeah.
I have heard that, yes. That
Yeah.
he was boiled alive in Rome, yes, and did not die, so then they exiled him to Patmos.
Yeah.
I have heard that.
Yeah.
And granted, we'll get into it later, but some of this old church stories we can take with a grain of salt.
Yeah. That's what church history has said. Yeah. So like you say, it's even though he died naturally, it wasn't a good time. Even if that story is, I don't know, one way or another, it wasn't a good time. And so it was still this way of like giving up the comfort and the familiarity and the safeness of life for Christ, because we saw that there was real fear there, because the Jewish leaders didn't like what they were doing. We saw that when they crucified Christ, and we saw that in the ways that these guys too went through terrible, terrible things. Yeah.